My name is Peter Marchant. I teach the literature of the Holocaust at the State University of New York College at Brockport. The title for this series is Why Teach the Holocaust? To teach the Holocaust, I have the good fortune to know survivors who come to class and give expert testimony. They lived the Holocaust. They're experts in it. Alec Mutz, my guest for today, was 10 years old in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, and then a few months later he was expelled from school with all the other Jewish boys. He was told by the principal of the school to leave and never come back, and he'll tell you that story. In 1945, at Liberation, he was 15 years old, by which time he'd lost his mother, his older brother Yitzhak, his sister Hannah. The only survivors were Alec and his father, Samuel Leipzig Mots. And the question is, how did they survive? Joining me is Dana Logsdon, an alumna of the course, a teacher who will be hosting this course in the fall, and Brian Moore, an alumnus of the course, who is chair of the English department at the Canandaigua Academy. And I'm going to begin by asking Alec to describe a critical moment. It was in June 1942, and it was in the summer. A hot afternoon, about 1 o'clock, he thinks, when there was a selection. They did not know, the Mutz family, what exactly the selection was for. Only there was a selection and there were trucks waiting nearby in which some of the Jews were told to climb into. Alec, that afternoon, what exactly happened? You were standing up in that pasture, a Tarnobchek. No.
The Jews were exiled from Tarnobchek to a community by the name Baranov, which was around 15 kilometers west of Tarnobchek. From Baranov, they got loaded into boxcars and taken to a community by the name Dembitz, which was a railhead. And the Jews were ordered to get off the boxcars and onto the pasture. There were Jews from all the surrounding communities on this pasture, and the German authorities were going around and selecting people and ordered them to mount on trucks. I saw my dad being ordered to get on a truck. I was sitting right alongside my mother and my sister and my relatives, grandfathers. And for reasons still unknown to me, I bolted, left my mother, sister, and the relatives sitting on a pasture, and climbed up the truck. And I sat down alongside my father. And this was the last time that I saw my mother, sister, and the rest of the relatives.
And your father said to you?
My father said to me, "We will never see your mother again."
And you said?
I said, "No, we'll see them."
But that didn't happen.
That did not happen.
The story really begins before World War I, in 1914, when Alec's father, Samuel Mots, was conscripted into the German army to serve on the Russian front. He was given a commission, he was a lieutenant, probably because he was literate.
Junior lieutenant because he was literate.
And then take the story on.
Well, my father was captured within a week after he was commissioned. So shows you the quality of the officer he was. And after his capture, he got shipped out to Siberia. He spent 48 months in Siberia helping to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad that goes from Moscow through China, Manchuria. And when the Tsar got thrown over in 1917, one of the guards came in. They lived mainly in dugouts, took the picture off the wall, the mess hall, they were in the mess hall, tossed it on the floor, shattered it, stomped on it, and he said, "Kids, you're free to go." He says, "No more Tsars here." And some prisoners decided to remain in Siberia and live there, but my dad decided to go back to his place of birth.
So he waited shrewdly till the weather was less bitterly cold.
He waited till early spring, and he set out, as he called it, on a hike from Siberia back to Poland.
And that was 1,300 miles or thereabouts.
That was pretty close to 2,500 miles.
2,500 miles?
Yes.
And how did he do it?
Well, mostly by foot, and to sustain himself, he would stop over at a farm and do a day's work. At that time, specifically in that area, a lot of farmers owned sheep and goats, and they used to make cheese from the sheep milk, goat milk. And according to my dad, he had a bag like a mailman has here. And after a day's or 2 days' work, he had a bag full of cheese. They were maybe about 3 or 4 inches in diameter, about a half an inch to 3/4 of an inch high, mostly dry. And then he would keep on walking. Orientation was done by the sun, sometimes by the moon. And when the weather was nice, it was mostly barefooted. When it was cold, he had a pair of, well, there were boots, felt-lined boots. He would carry them so as to not to wear out his boots, keep his feet warm. Only at night he had to be very careful because the place was inhabited by bears. And he finally made his way back to Poland after about 7.5, almost 8 months walking.
Well, there is a story about his arrival in Tarnobrzeg. The town was in complete darkness.
There was no lighting. And there was one gas-driven light, and that was one individual, and that was a civil service job. He was the gas lighter.
And then Samuel Mutz goes to the front door of his father's house and beats on the door. And his father comes, grandfather opens the door with an axe.
He opens the door with an axe. Says, "What are you doing here?" He says, "Well," he says, "you know, I'm Samuel, I'm your son." He says, "No, you're supposed to be dead." Says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Yes. You know, in the Jewish religion, it's a custom to say a prayer after someone had departed for 1 year." And he says, "You know, I've been," he says, "praying for the dead, and you're supposed to be dead. Because one of the sergeants that came back told me that he saw you being killed when the Cossacks were riding by on their horses. They kept on throwing hand grenades into the foxholes. And you were in that particular foxhole, so I saw your son being dead. So you're supposed to be dead."
But there is a reason why he was met with an axe.
The reason was my grandfather, we had a little backyard alongside the house where we lived, and he would always raise chickens, and for the Jewish holiday they would raise geese. lard was at a premium. So it used to force feed those geese, so they were nice and fat. Geese, when you disturb them at night, are awful noisy. They'll scream and yell. Well, they woke up my grandfather, and his only defense was he kept that axe right alongside the door, and he gets out. There was some individual that had a goose under his arm. And Grandfather says, "What are you doing? Those are my geese, you know. I worked very hard. I need the food. You trying to steal my geese?" Guy says, "No, no, I wouldn't do this to you. I'm just trying to find out how much it weighs."
Eventually, the grandfather and son recognized each other, and there was rejoicing. And then Samuel Mutz was conscripted into the Polish army.
For another 2 years.
This time as a corporal to look after the horses. So he had 2 more years in military service. And then he came out of the army and settled down as a tailor in Tarnobrzeg.
He learned his tailoring. It was the custom to go to learn a trade when you were around 8 years old, 7 years old. So when he was conscripted, he was already an experienced craftsman in tailoring.
And he was very clever. Alec, your story of how he could sew,
He could thread a needle backwards. And then the finest little orifice that a needle has, just backwards, and there, he's got it all.
So Alex,
I can't even do it now because I'm going blind frontwards.
Alec's father had Yitzhak, Alec's older brother, and Hannah, Alec's sister. And he ran a very prosperous tailoring business because he was the best tailor in Tarnobrzeg. And the aristocracy of the town would patronize him. The Countess Tarnov would come and choose a pattern, and your father would make a costume, and he would take it up to the castle.
Yeah, he almost derived all his livelihood from the Countess, almost full time. He used to go to a larger town, Tarnów, and buy the wools and the linen that would go into the garment, and the furs. Some people like to have fur-lined garments. So he would buy the pelt and put the garment together. It was all custom tailored. By and large, it was bartering. He'll make a garment, and for a year's worth or half a year's worth of potatoes, onions, carrots. So this was the system at that time.
And your childhood was a very happy one.
So I raised the roof with everything. There was one clock in the house that Dad and his employees used to watch, when to go home for lunch, when to go home for supper. And I decided I wanted to find out what makes it tick. So I took it apart, climbed up there, and was standing on a veranda, and he looked up and he says, "Well, what happened to the clock?" He knew right there and then that there was no one that would do this except me. So I got my hide tanned. I'm always the one.
Alec, when your father was asked to go back into the Army, what was his reaction to that after having gone through a 2,500-mile journey?
There was no question. That was the order, and there was no way out. Poland became a sovereign country after that, and he was born in that area, and he was a citizen. So that was it.
No options.
No options.
When you were expelled from school, describe that scene. The principal gets the Jewish boys together and...
Well, there was one SS trooper that came by, and are there any Jews in the class? And yeah, must have been 7 of us. And he said, out. Catch you again here going to school, you go to jail. So I was fair-haired, practically platinum white, and this SS guy, apparently he must have been brainwashed. And he says, are you a Jew? I said, yes. Your parents Jews? I said, yes. Your grandparents? Your grandfather? I said, yes. How about your grandmother? I said, she's dead. She died. He says, that's good. He says, next time we'll catch you here. He says, we'll execute you.
And then you were in the rabbi's sanctuary, which had been turned into a ghetto.
Well, it was a ghetto. The rabbi sanctuary was converted into a slave labor camp.
And your job?
My job initially was this German that owned us. He liked to raise pigs. So the directory, where the rabbi lived, was converted into a pigsty. And actually, that was a premier job because I used to steam the potatoes. I was a big boy already. I was 12 plus. And big red potatoes. And used to steam them and mash them up, pour some milk in it, and feed it to the pigs. So before the people went to work on the road gang, I used to steal the potatoes and give them to the people that went to work. After all, the pigs can just squeal. They're not going to tell that I stole their potatoes. But within a matter of a few short months, the place got rat infested. There were just rats there all over the place, and it was nothing unusual. I would put the food for the potatoes in, and there was competition between the rats and the pigs. And every once in a while, the rats would nibble on the pig's snout. Mm-hmm. But I had what to eat. And besides, when it was cold, I put the hot potatoes in my jacket, in my pockets, kept me warm for a while.
You were nearly shot, were you not, when there was the prisoner count?
Yes, initially in this rabbi sanctuary, there was supposed to have been 100 prisoners, and no more. And when we got transported from the selection place, Dembitz, back to the rabbi sanctuary or into the rabbi sanctuary, we were lined up and we counted. They count again and again and again. Well, there's 101. And the 2 Gestapo guys and one of the guys that owned the slaves. And I guess, you know, I'm only supposed to have 100, but we have 101. So one of the Gestapo guys points to me. He's right nearby. You could hear him talk. He says, don't worry about it. He says, tomorrow morning I'll be here and I'll take that little guy out. He says, you know, he's useless. Why feed him? So I was awaiting execution the following day. By coincidence, there was another individual. He was a double orphan. We knew him, my father knew him, I knew who he was. And he decided to escape because he knew very well what had happened to his grandmother. He made it to the riverbank. The river Vistula was right nearby. The city of Tarnobrzeg is right under the Vistula River. They caught up with him and summarily executed him, tossed him in the river. And when they came back, they counted again. There were 100, so they were satisfied and left me alone.
Your father had a certain privilege because of his skill at tailoring.
And he did some tailoring for people that came to Poland to colonize or Germanize the country.
So he made a uniform for the son.
Well, that was in the second concentration camp. That was in Mielec. That was Schwamberger's son. Schwamberger was one of the most savage, notorious, murderous anyone can possibly imagine. For him to come in and pull his gun out, put a bullet through someone's head. So you looked at me. Boom. One time he lined up 37 people, just summarily executed him. He had his wife, his mother-in-law, and his son. The son, if he was 8 years old, it was all there. And he came in to my dad's tailor shop, which was at that time nothing more than a shack, loaded with clothing from the floor to the ceiling. And he ordered my dad to tailor a uniform for his son. And Dad complied, and he complimented my father what a well-fitted uniform this was, and proceeds to hand the son a gun on a gun belt. And he says, "You come with me, and I will show you how to execute the little Jews, and I'll take care of the big ones." At that instance, the wife heard it, and she started to scream and yell. She says, "He's got time. He's just young. He will learn how to execute Jews. Don't worry about it." So this guy Schwamberger pulls a gun out and he points it at the wife. He says, "You must be a Jew lover." He said, "I want to blow your head off. You're not going to allow my son to come with me to kill Jews?" I was not a witness to this. My father was.
You were ill, weren't you? And your father hid you.
The convention was in this concentration camp Mielec. There was a dispensary. And if you spent more than 2 days, 2 days was the limit. On the third day, they would come in and toss you on a horse-driven wagon and take you out to execute you. Well, I got sick, and I wound up in this dispensary. So the doctor, which was also a prisoner, he was a Jew, came running into my father, and he says, "Look, you better," he says, "take care of your son, or else tomorrow," he says, "I'll have to toss him on a horse-drawn cart." So my dad came in and carried me on his back into his tailor shop. There was a pot-bellied stove, and as I mentioned, that shack was loaded with clothing from the floor to the ceiling, shoes tucked in, tied with the sleeves. It was specifically for prisoners that otherwise the clothes would fall apart on them and nothing to wear. And my dad hid me in the pile of clothes. And one thing they were pretty sensitive about it is accounting. No matter how bad the weather was, you stood there for hours. They count, and they count, and they count. Quite often they'll drag someone out that had died during the night and say, "Well, here." And I was in this pile of clothes. In comes the Commandant, Schwamberger. He says, "We're missing a Jew," and he says, "It's your son." "Where is your son?" And screaming and yelling, he pulls his gun out and empties it into the pile of clothes.
Then he leaves, and your
I am
father
on the floor,
says,
and he was just shooting from the hip.
he leaves, and your father says,
"Are you okay? Did you hear what he did?" He says, "Yeah, I heard everything. I heard him screaming and yelling." And then on the same afternoon, because work was not too far, when they brought the prisoners back to be fed, I emerged and joined the group of prisoners and went back to work.
Alec, did you realize what a dire situation you were in as a young child until he shot into that pile of clothing?
It didn't even enter my mind. It was an everyday occurrence. I mean, that's something that you lived with and you saw and you got used to it. And if you could talk, if you could eat, you know, you weren't hit yet anyway. But as far as being hit, it was just a matter of course.
Mm-hmm. You were seriously ill with what I suppose to be strep throat.
That was in Germany toward the war's end. I came down with a raging throat ache, and it was pretty bad. I could hardly swallow my own saliva. And I went to this dispensary. It was a big, large room with benches all around it, and there were a lot of people sitting all around waiting to be cared for. The temperature must have been in the low teens. That was in Germany, in Bavaria. That was my last concentration camp. And in walks this guy, Heiner Schmitz. He was a medical doctor, a graduate of one of the finest medical schools in Germany, but he was a sadist. He was an officer in the German army, and he accrued about 70 to 75% of fatalities. He loved to operate. So finally, they decided to toss him out of the German army. Not only this, but they had him castrated because of mental problems. He knew someone in Himmler's staff, one of his college buddies, and he got in touch with him. I have read this. And his buddy said, "Don't worry, we'll get you a job." Sure enough, his friend made contact for him with Heinrich Himmler, and he says, "You know, there's a job available in Flossenburg." That's the last concentration camp that I was in. But he says, "Warn your friend, if he doesn't keep his mouth shut of what's going on there, there'll be a spot against the wall for him." He says, but there, he says, he can do whatever he wants, provided he keeps it to himself. And they used to bring in Allied prisoners there. He used to euthanize them. And I go into this dispensary. He was a short, stocky guy, and he had a vial suspended from his neck with a little brush. There were no mirrors and no talking. And paint a number on your forehead. And then you ordered into a cubicle, and they would do their deeds on you. While I'm sitting and waiting there, there's one of the orderlies, which also was a prisoner. In no likelihood, he was a doctor. He comes out carrying a severed leg. Well, opens the door, puts the leg in there, closes the door. But 2 or 3 minutes later, another door opens, another orderly comes out, and he carries a severed head by the hair, with all kinds of tags hanging out. I said, "Alec, you finally arrived." So I sit and wait. He comes by, puts something on my forehead. A minute or so later, I'm ordered into a cubicle. And this Heinrich Schmitz comes in, turns to the orderly, and in German he says, "Give me the knife." Then,
Oh,
he says, "We're done." That gurney was full of caked up blood, filthy, crummy. I got up, bleeding. Well, they swabbed some alcohol before the cut and after the cut, but I was bleeding. And as I said, the order was no clogs or no shoes, anything to go in there. They didn't want you to mess up the floor. you walk out of there, forget about looking for shoes or boots or anything. So, snow, cold, I bolted back to the barrack. And they had a lot of second-hand cement bags there that were used to fill with ashes and sell the ashes to the farmers or give it to the farmers. Because ash is potassium, it makes a good fertilizer. So I got a hold of a cement bag and ripped it up. And at that time, what little did I know, that there is cement that sticks to the paper and it'll dehydrate. And within a week or so, it formed a crust and it healed up and stopped bleeding. He missed my jugular vein by a fraction of an inch. And then when he came to Rochester, started to see a doctor, and I told him the story. Oh, he says, you know, I got a plastic surgeon, he says, and it won't cost you anything. And you come, he says, we'll take care of it. We'll take care of this too, he says. He says, you got to get rid of this. And
that is?
That is KL. That was done in Helles in Poland.
Koncentrationslager.
Yeah, Konzentrationslager. And every time I'd see him, he'd start the same story over again. And I found, well, I gotta peel this off of me. And I told him, Dr. Urles, one should not tamper with evidence. That was the end of that story right there.
Yeah.
Alec, would you tell the story of your father's boots?
Oh, yeah. My father got a hold of a pair of shoes, which was quite unusual. And in order to hold on to whatever few possessions you had, your shoes or boots were your pillow. Tie the shoelaces together, tie it to your hand, and you sleep on it. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, no matter how hard you try to survive, hold on to it, there's always somebody that's one step ahead of you in some devious way. Well, somebody stole my father's shoes. Bitter cold. He has got to go out to work. He got a hold, again, of paper, cement, from cement bag and some burlap bag, and there he was. I was determined to find my father's shoes. People are coming in from work to the barracks, and I stay in the doorway, and I watch feet. Shuffles in one of the Russian prisoners. The shoes didn't fit. The heels were sticking out. I recognized my father's boots. In every barrack, there was a block ältester, which is the elderly that's in charge of this particular block. Almost all the time, the guy in charge of the barracks was a German. He was a criminal. He was a convict. Most of the time, a murderer. So, as soon as I spotted this Russian, I said, you know, those are my father's shoes. Yeah. The guy said, what? He says, those are my shoes. You see, I'm wearing them. I says, but they don't fit you. He says, that's my business. I went over to this person in charge, if you want to call him a person, to this murderer, and I told him, he says, you know, this guy stole my father's shoes. He says, this communist stole your father's shoes? I said, yeah, those are my father's shoes. They had little stools, three-legged stools, a seat about 3 inches thick. He picked up that stool and hit him in the head over it. He just crushed his skull. He killed the guy. And he says, he says, take your father's shoes back. And within half an hour later, the body collectors came around and tossed them on the cart, and that was it.
And
my father says, why did you do? He says, you know, he says, this guy killed him. I says, I wanted you to have the shoes. He says, the burlap bags would have been okay until, he says, somebody else would have died. and I would have gotten a pair of shoes off him. I says, well, the guy died. He says, through you, because of you. Shame. So that's the way life was in the concentration camps, especially in the last one.
That was Flossenburg,
Yeah.
where conditions were terrible.
By the way, this guy that cut my throat, they caught up with him. He came down with typhus. They picked him up out of the hospital and brought him into Dachau. He was charged, tried, and executed by hanging. By his own admission, he says he worked very hard. He served his country, and that was the methodology. And they asked him, anyone asked you or ordered you to euthanize Allied prisoners? There was silence. He says, how many did you do a day? He said, I worked very hard. And one day, he said, he did 90. Yeah. And when they pronounced sentence, I was a witness for the prosecution. He said, before you execute it, is there anything you want to say? He says, please. He says, don't hang me. Hanging is for thieves. And it was a military tribunal. There was a brigadier general, some officers alongside him. This guy turned crimson. He got up. I thought it was going to explode. He says, hanging is for thieves? You don't even measure up to be a thief. Hanging he will. He turns to the captain, you carry out the order tomorrow morning before sunrise. And then the captain says, yes, sir. And what was that?
Was this right after the war, Alec?
That was 1946.
1946.
Yeah, about a year after the war.
Mm-hmm.
But not all the stories were horrible. There were good people. Tell them about the potato lady.
Oh, yeah. During the Death March, we were marched out from Flossenburg. All the Jews were ordered together in the camp square and set out on a death march from Flossenburg to Dachau, or to a place where they could mass execute us without leaving after effects. And we started out April 14th, 1945. And the weather had turned so bad, so cold, snow, sleet, rain. I mean, you couldn't keep up. You were finished. That was the end of that. And it was on a Sunday toward the end, just before the liberation. We were marching, and there was this elderly lady. She had just come home from church. She apparently was raising pigs, and she had some steamed potatoes, and she started to throw the potatoes at the prisoners. I mean, a bite of a potato, you could go on for another while, maybe a few minutes, maybe an hour or so. And one of the SS guys pulled a gun. He says, I'll blow your head off. If you, he says, that's the scum. That's the lowest of the low. And you're going to feed them? He says, well, those are the potatoes that I steamed for the pigs. He says, you're better off. He says, feeding it to the pigs. He pulled his gun out and he pointed it at her. And she pulled the Bible out. And she no longer tossed potatoes. When I went back 10 years ago, I was invited by the German government to come back to help them celebrate the commemoration of the liberation. This lady was present. They wheeled her in a wheelchair. And, we gave her a bouquet of flowers, which really made the trip worthwhile, just to see her. And so here she risked her life. The guy could have he could have killed her and nothing would have been said. There were bodies all over the place in the gutters, and getting shot or getting killed was, during the Death March, was just a routine. To the best of my recollection, there were 2,600 Jews that marched out, and within a matter of a week, there were about 412 left, and out of the 412, more than half died within a year. I have witnessed a farmer giving a prisoner a chunk of bacon. He ate it, and within a matter of a few hours, it was all over for him. Another prisoner that I saw, he got a hold of a chunk of rock salt, which was a common supplement to add to the feed of the cattle. They get thirstier. The more thirsty they get, the more they drink, the more they eat, and so that's how they were fattening them up. And he got a hold of a chunk of rock salt, ate it, and his head swelled up to about twice the size of a head should be, and within a matter of a few hours, it was all over for him too. So quite a few people died because of that.
Excuse me, your father was with you on the document?
My father was with me all the time.
All the time?
Yeah, that brings back, one of the guards yells out, "Is there a tailor here?" My father said, "Yes, I'm a tailor," and he always carried a thimble and some thread and a needle. And this guy had just gotten promoted to corporal. And he says, "You Jew," he says, "you're going to sew my stripes on. They better be straight, otherwise," he says, "you'll be done for." My father says, "Don't worry." He says, they'll be straight." And my father sewed his stripes on for him, and he gave him a cracker, which my father tucked in and guarded it and came over. He says, "We got something to eat." And tried to break that cracker, you needed a sledge practically. So you had to salivate on it if you could. Then you break it up and
you could share it.
Yeah, let alone the lice and the and the flies and fleas.
In April 1945, and the war is coming to an end. Germany has lost the war. It's within days of Hitler's suicide, and a prisoner came to Flossenburg, and there was a public hanging.
Oh, you're referring to Bonhoeffer?
Yes.
Well, hanging was almost always public. When they hung Bonhoeffer, I didn't know who the man was, and by the way, it was totally indifferent because this was the convention. I mean, that was it. One thing, he was not scarred. He was from where I was. I don't think he was abused. They marched him up in the nude, and they put the noose around his neck, and they hung him. But the drop was quite shallow, so if the neck isn't broken, you don't die instantaneously. You just literally choke to death. And they had the SS guy, and one of the guys, the doctor was there, and within a matter of 2 or 3 minutes, they took him down. He was still twitching, and they rolled him straight into the cemetery, into the crematoria. Later on, I found out that he was a world-renowned theologian and a preacher.
And he opposed Hitler from the very beginning.
Yes, he was a very, very bright man. He was a PhD in theology. He earned this here in this country, and he went back. He openly preached that Hitler is anti-Christ, that this cannot go on like this, and he wanted to be with his brethren, with his Jews, and so they did away with him.
Alec, we would really like to know, what did your father teach you through all of this?
What did he teach me?
Mm-hmm.
That there are so many people, so many varieties of character. Yeah. Some are indifferent, some are bad, some are good, some are smart, some are not so bright. But this is a big, wide world. Learn to live your life and learn to accept. Do not carry a grudge.
And when you speak to students, what would you like them to take away from the story that you tell? What do you hope that they'll learn or hear?
Well, what I hope for is that they will learn of what a dictatorship, what stereotyping can do, what brainwashing can do. And the last comment that I have to say to them, take an interest in your surrounding. If somebody runs for public office, make sure you know the individual, who he is, why he is running, what's his purpose in doing what he wants to do, what type of character is he. Mm-hmm. And this in itself can be an aid in having a democratic process.
I'm afraid the talk comes to an end, but Alec is in schools and he tells more stories. You need to ask him to tell more. Thank you very much, Alec, for being with us. Bran, thank you very much. And Dana, thank you very much.